Good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Schreiner, the founder and president of the board of the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania project. Welcome to our speaker series. Just a couple businesses we need to take care of ahead of time. This will be recorded, so if you'd like to see it again, you can go to our website or you can send the website information to friends and family if they'd like to see Jane's lecture. You will be muted and your cameras are automatically turned off. There will be an opportunity to ask Dr. Goodall some questions at the end. You can use the Q&A moniker on your computer and type in your question, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in a decent amount of time. So it's my real honor to present Dr. Jane Goodall, who really doesn't need very much introduction since she is an icon and an inspiration for many of us, including myself. But I will fill you in with a few tidbits. Jane was born in Bournemouth, England, and even as a small child, she showed an amazing fascination with animals and their behavior. She once spent all day in a chicken coop trying to understand where eggs came from. I think she's figured that out by now. She will tell you that her first and most influential teacher was not Louis Leakey, the renowned anthropologist, but rather her dog, Rusty. She was inspired by Dr. Doolittle's stories and Tarzan, and followed her dream to Africa at the invitation of a friend where she met Dr. Leakey. He recognized her intelligence, patience, and profound connection to the natural world. At his bequest, she traveled to Western Tanzania and the forests of Gombe to study chimpanzees. Of course, most of us know much of the rest of the story. Failure is not an option for Jane, so after many months of no interactions, the chimps finally let her into their lives. Her work at Gombe is one of the most pivotal treatises on primate behavior and the evolution of humans, and became the basis of her PhD at Darwin College in Cambridge. Her many years at Gombe honed her skills as a scientist, but perhaps more importantly, as an advocate for animals and the natural world. Watching the destruction of the forests of Africa, Jane became passionate about speaking out for the planet, and she is now one of the most important and influential advocates for stewardship of animals and the environment. Through her instrumental organizations, Roots and Shoots and the Jane Goodall Institute, she continues to inspire young people all over the world to change our course of destiny and help heal the planet. For her work, Kofi Annan named her one of the United Nations Messengers of Peace in 2002, and she was knighted by Prince, now King, Charles III in 2004. 15 years ago, I had just returned from one of our trips to Africa with the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania project. My assistant called me and asked if I was sitting down. She told me that Jane Goodall was in need of a new physician and that I had been recommended. And by the way, she's very busy, she's very healthy, and she doesn't like talky doctors. And also, by the way, she's coming tomorrow. And so it began, my very special and much treasured friendship with my childhood icon, Jane Goodall. Tonight, knowing that she can, I've asked her to speak on no small topic, the state of the world. Please welcome Jane Goodall.
Thank you, Kim, for all that.
It's my pleasure. So I kind of gave you a big topic, but I know that you can really address this. And we want to sort of start off with where are we now in the current situation with climate change, with environmental destruction, and where can we go forward in terms of trying to protect the planet, and what can an individual do to really make a difference in that adventure?
That's a lot of questions.
It's a lot of questions, but we'll come back to that.
Okay, well, first of all, I think everybody listening, and certainly you, we know we're going through very dark times, politically, socially, and especially environmentally. I mean, you know, there's climate change. Climate change is real. It's causing changes in weather patterns all around the globe. We're in the midst of the 6th great extinction. We have rising population and diminishing natural resources. The natural resources are finite. There's a crazy notion there can be unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources, which already in some places are being used up faster than nature can replenish them. So it's not a happy place, but if everybody loses hope, then they become apathetic. If we all lose hope and become apathetic, we're doomed. But luckily, it's not only me who believe that we have a window of time in which if we get together and if we tackle these problems, then there's still a chance that we can slow down climate change, slow down the extinction of species. And so for me, hope is not wishful thinking. It's about taking action to move towards that hope. And that's what we have to do.
And you've spoken about that a lot, Jane, and I think you focused on not only institutions and governments, but also individuals in doing that. And maybe you could address a little bit about what each of us can do as individuals, choices we make, and how we can empower our governments to start making some substantial changes.
Okay, well, I think, it's true that many people come to me and say they've looked around the world, they've looked around at the problems of the world, they're one person, there's nothing they can do, and they've given up. And so they say, well, what should I do? And I say, well, look, we keep hearing, think globally, act locally. But it's the wrong way round. Because if you think globally, I defy you or anybody listening to not feel depressed. You cannot look around at what's happening in the whole world, especially now with wars, and then there's conflicts and violence everywhere and corruption. You're bound to feel depressed. So I say to them, okay, you can't change the world, but go to where you live. Is there something that bothers you there? Maybe it's the litter in the street. Maybe it's treatment of stray dogs. Maybe it's the homeless or something. And then try and get some friends together and see what you can do about it. And you find you can make a difference. And that makes you feel good. So then you want to do more. And this is like a spiral. It inspires other people who join you. And then knowing that around the world there are other people also coping with local problems, then you dare to think globally. So when you ask what an individual can do, it really depends on the individual, because somebody living in poverty obviously can't make the same kind of difference as CEO of a big corporation who can sign a check to change millions of lives for the better or the worse. But just, most of us who have a reasonable sort of level of income, we can make choices about what we buy. We ask ourselves, where was it made? Did it harm the environment? Could we have bought it locally and saved all those air miles, saved all those emissions going up into the atmosphere? Did it harm animals? Is it shorter them like the factory farms? Is it cheap because of unfair wages somewhere? And if so, don't buy it. And that leads to consumer pressure on the particular business, and businesses are changing. So that's what we can all do. We can go to bed at night and think, is the world a little bit better because of what we did today? And if it is, well, hundreds of other people are doing their little bit. So that moves us towards a better world.
When you were in the jungles in Gombe as a young woman, were you optimistic or pessimistic about where the environment was going or what the situation was, or were you just so focused on studying the chimps and their behavior that you didn't think about it very much?
Well, when I began in 1960, there weren't these environmental problems. We hadn't started. I mean, there were some very far-sighted scientists who talked about, the gradual collection of emissions, CO2, methane in the environment, but it wasn't a big problem. Gombe National Park, where we still study chimps, we're in our 63rd year. It was part of a great forest belt that stretched right across equatorial Africa. And that's not the case now. But back then, we were not worrying about the environment because there was nothing hitting us that was really going wrong with the environment. Now, it's everywhere.
And you've talked about the deforestation that's happened in many places around the world, but personally for you in Gombe, can you sort of speak to that a little bit and what you saw, how bad it had become, and perhaps some of the things that are being done now to help restore those very, very important biodiversity areas?
Yes, it was in 1986. that I helped organize a conference in Chicago to bring together for the first time researchers who by then were studying chimpanzees in 6 different parts of Africa. I mean, when I began, it was just me. There was nobody else. And so the aim of the conference was, does chimpanzee behavior differ from environment to environment? Is there something like culture, which I dared to suggest and was absolutely black in the scientific community? Culture is human. But at that conference, we had a session on the environment. And it was shocking because right across Africa, this was 1986, forests were disappearing, chimpanzee numbers were dropping. And I just knew I had to try and do something about it. So I got together a bit of money, the Geographic helped, and visited these other study sites and learned a lot about the problems faced by the chimps, mostly environmental destruction, but bushmeat hunting, shooting mothers to steal babies to sell them overseas as pet circuses, and in those days, medical research. But I also learned a lot about plight of so many of the people, the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitat, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education facilities, the growing populations, the degradation of the land, the people and their livestock moving deeper and deeper into the forest, coming in contact with other animals, catching their diseases and vice versa. And it came to a head when I flew over my beloved little Gombe National Park in Tanzania. And as I say, in 1960, it was part of a great forest. By the late 1980s, it was a tiny island of forest surrounded by bare hills, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere, struggling to survive. So why were they cutting down the trees? To make money from charcoal or timber, or to make land free in order to grow food to feed their growing families. And so they were literally struggling to survive. And that's when it hit me. If we don't help these people find ways of making a living without destroying the environment, we can't save chimpanzees, forests, or anything else. And so the Jane Goodall Institute, JGI, we began our program, which is known as Tokari. It started with Take Care, Tokari. And it's very holistic and unusual for the time. It wasn't a bunch of arrogant white people going into these 12 poor villages around Gombe and telling them what we could do to make their lives better. No, it was a carefully picked team of 7 Tanzanians, locals, who went into the villages and sat down and asked, what do you think we could do to make your lives better? So, of course, first off, they wanted more land for food. They wanted better health and education facilities for their children. So that's where we began. And it couldn't give them more land. So it meant restoring fertility to overused farmland without chemicals. And then gradually, as the people came to trust us, we could introduce water management, scholarships to give girls a chance of secondary education, microfinance opportunities, particularly for women to start their own small environmentally sustainable projects, businesses, and family planning. Very well received, because even in the poorest villages, they understood one way out of poverty was a good education for your children. And they could no longer afford to educate 8 or 10 children, which was normal for a woman in 1960. So that's the Tokari program, now in 104 villages throughout Chimp Range in Tanzania and in 6 other African countries where we work with chimpanzees.
That's really amazing. Have you noticed, and I know that there's been an increase in chimp populations, has that really led to healthier populations, more robust strength in the different chimp communities because of what you're doing with the locals and land management and so
where we actually work, the chimp population is either stable or slightly increased. But over the whole of Africa, we can't be everywhere, not yet. And numbers are still dropping.
And to that point, Jane, and Africa is an amazing part of the world, an enormously important part of keeping the entire globe, the biodiversity and the control of climate and so forth going. Africa also has a very young population, and I know that maybe if you could speak a little bit about Roots and Shoots, which is all over the world, but especially in Africa, and your interaction with young Africans who, by the year 2030, about 42% of the entire global youth will be African, and around 40% now of Africa are people under age 30. So I think that there is a tremendous future for Africa and Africans in terms of the continent, but how do you inspire people to keep that going and balance that with their own wanting to have decent lives for their families?
Yes, and think about population. So
Yeah.
It all began when 12 high school students came to my house in Dar es Salaam, capital of Tanzania, and they were concerned about things going on in their environment. Why isn't the government doing something about the poaching in our national parks? Why isn't the government doing something about the illegal dynamite fishing, which is destroying the coral reefs? Why isn't somebody doing something about the street children with nowhere to live? These were the kind of questions they had. And so I said, well, get your friends, we'll have a meeting and we'll see what can be done. So I think that first meeting was about 30 young people. These were high school students. But back then it was difficult to get into school. So they were about 18, 19, even 20 in high school. And that's when this Roots and Shoots program was born. And we decided that nothing would happen unless the young people took it into their own hands. It was their future at stake. And so we decided that the most important message was every individual makes an impact on the planet every single day. And that individual has a choice as to what kind of impact he or she will make. Secondly, because everything is interrelated, which you learn so well in nature, each group would choose 3 projects. Not every child would have to do every project, but between them, one project help people, one help animals, one help the environment. And they would talk about what they cared about as individuals. They'd sit down and think what could be done. They'd roll up their sleeves and get out there and take action. It's all about action. And that program is now in every Tanzanian district. It's in 68 countries around the world. It's got members, kindergarten, university. It's very strong in university, everything in between. Even some adult groups are now forming, like the staff of big corporations. They are changing the world. And we're slowly growing in different parts of Africa. So for me, it's my greatest reason for hope is the young people. We've still got 2,000 groups in China. The Chinese love it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very impactful way of really kind of getting people to become engaged. You talked a little bit about the natural world and this kind of union between humans and natural world and animals and so forth and the ecosystem. And you once said that an ecosystem is sort of like a tapestry. If you pull a thread, the whole thing can fall apart. We have sort of witnessed some of that recently with the global pandemic, where perhaps pandemic pathogens have originated in animals and have jumped species and caused severe illness throughout the world. And that certainly has happened with HIV, with chimpanzees as being the reservoir for that disease. So there's an encounter that affects people medically in the natural world, but also the search for new and important developments in herbal medications, herbal things that can be used for medicines. And you told me earlier this evening that chimpanzees themselves actually can doctor themselves and have the ability to understand what sort of herbs and things can make them feel better. Can you comment a little bit on that and how that spills over into perhaps some pharmaceutical opportunities for places in developing areas?
Well, I'm sure it does, because we know how many cures have come actually from plants, particularly in Latin America.
Yes.
But Africa's coming up. We're getting some of these They used to be called witch doctors. White witch doctors were ones who gave you medicine. Black witch doctors put curses on you. But the white witch doctors are now called herbal healers or medicinal healers. And what's fascinating is that some of the leaves eaten by people to cure tummy ache, headache, something like that, are used by the chimps for the same purpose. So who taught who? Or did they both come to it by accident? But the chimps, one of the leaves that I love, it's a very hairy leaf, and it's long shaped, and they roll it up with the hairs outside, and they swallow it, and it scrapes the internal parasites. You find it in their dung, all these parasites caught up in the hairs. I don't know if people use that leaf. They don't talk about it, maybe. But
Maybe some of our gastroenterologists that are watching will take that up.
Yeah.
We'll have to
Yes,
see.
yeah. So anyway, it's absolutely fascinating that chimps do try to cure themselves of different diseases.
Are there hierarchies? Are there sort of providers in the chimp community that the other chimps turn to for that kind of treatment? As sort of like a physician caregiver, or
No,
maybe not quite that much, huh?
No, it's infants watching their mothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about some of the families that you got to know? Of course, perhaps the most famous is David Greybeard, who was the first chimp that actually made contact with you. But of course, Flo, who was the matriarch of a very important family. Are some of their ancestors still in Gombe, and do you have an opportunity to see them and see how those families have branched out?
Well, we certainly have a research team there now, carefully following the Flo family. Flo with her offspring, the adolescent Fabian and Figan and Fifi, and then Flint was born, and Flame was born, and then the eldest daughters had children. So we've still got some of the F family left. The main characters have gone, ones I knew. And then the other big powerful family now, who's overtaken the F family to our amazement, was started off by the chimp Melissa, who was the first chimp we knew to have twins, because normally it's one child. And by the way, they're spaced 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. So they are not overpopulating their environment in the wild. And of course, there's fairly high death rate as well. So because we had a lot of chimps with names beginning with M at the time, the daughter was called Gremlin. And Gremlin is now the matriarch. And she has a strong, growing family. And it's absolutely fascinating to see, and now because we've been going for 62 years, we can ask questions like, well, is this behavior kind of inherited, or is it changed because of environmental conditions, things that happened to the growing child or adolescent? And so, the research is getting more valuable with every year we add.
Do you monitor the health conditions of the chimpanzees? Have you noticed some change, any kind of new diseases or changes that have happened with them, perhaps brought in by humans or perhaps a result of environmental destruction?
Well, there is a kind of influenza type disease which may have come from humans. We used to think that the polio vaccine of the polio virus, that in the labs, chimps, because they're so like us, were infected, as you know, with the polio virus. And it turned out they didn't get the symptoms. So they weren't good models after all. Though hundreds were caught from the wild for that research, and it wasn't any good. And Bob Gallo was one of the ones who said, why am I hemmed in by these ridiculous determination to use chimpanzee models? They're useless. Yet he was one of the ones who started the push to get them. Anyway, but there's the SIV, which is where it all began. And that is spreading in our community, and it's very worrying. And it's making them weaker and more susceptible to other kinds of disease.
One of the things that the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania project is very much interested in is participating in this global consortium called One Health, which speaks to that, the sort of overlap between infectious diseases and disease in general and health among animal communities and human communities and environmental issues that also play a role there. And I think for the audience's information, Dr. Goodall's chimpanzees played a pivotal role in the discovery of the origin of HIV, because it was your chimps, not that were the origin of HIV, but it was the ability to collect chimp scat and do the genomic testing that allowed the scientists such as Dr. Beatrice Hahn come up with the evolutionary clock that determined that the SIV was probably the progenitor for HIV, eventually through chimpanzees, especially more in Western Africa. But I think that there's a desire now on the part of many professionals in different kinds of health work to think about not just humans, but also diseases that we see in animals and how that can feed into diseases in the community. And again, we're just now, sort of emerging from a very serious pandemic where that's a very dramatic example. And I think going forward, we need to be vigilant about watching for disease states that are occurring in wild animals and how that can affect us and taking care of it before it does.
Yeah, and a very serious one, of course, is Ebola.
Yes.
And that decimated gorilla populations in West Africa and Central Africa.
Yes, and it can certainly go the other way, can't it?
Yeah.
So the humans, even though the organism might have come from a zoonotic spillover, that animals and especially primates are very prone to that. And humans, of course, can bring diseases to animals. Measles, I think, is a big problem among some of the mountain gorillas and has been an issue there. So I think this interconnectedness is something that you've been such a powerful and early spokesperson for in terms of that. In talking a little bit about science, you mentioned all of the families with the flow and all of the folks that the chimps that you had there, and you got a lot of criticism for giving them human names, which has subsequently come full circle and realized that perhaps that was a very good way of identifying individuals. They're not organisms or subjects, that they are individuals. But can you talk a little bit about your early encounters with some of the sort of criticisms that were coming from established science?
Oh, yes. Dr. Leakey chose me to go and study the chimps because I hadn't been to college. We couldn't afford it. My friends all went off to university and I had to become a secretary because we could just afford that training. And it was boring, and still I got a job. And then I got this invitation to go to Africa from that school friend and met Louis Leakey. And he said, Jane, I chose you because you hadn't been to university, because of the very, what do you want to call it, reductionist attitude of science at that time towards animals. We were totally separated. We were on our pinnacle, and there was nothing to connect us, the other animals. Came from religion, I suppose. Anyway, when I finally got to Cambridge, because Leakey said, okay, now I want scientists to take you seriously, so you have to get a degree. And there's no time for an undergraduate degree. Got me a place in Cambridge University in the UK to do a degree in ethology. And I was nervous. Can you imagine? I hadn't been to college and I'm kind of breaking the rules, so to speak. Imagine how I felt when the professor said I'd done everything wrong. Shouldn't have named the chimps, they should have had numbers. You can't talk about their personalities, minds capable of solving problems, and certainly not emotions, happiness, sadness, fear. Those are unique to humans. And so it was my dog, as you mentioned, it was my dog, Rusty. You can't share your life with an animal. You have dogs. They have personalities. That they can be intelligent. You certainly know they have emotions. They tell you if they're sad or angry or something like that. So I just quietly went on writing about chimps the way they were. And my advisor was one of the top 3 ethologists in Europe at the time, in the world, I suppose. And he was my sternest critic. Then he came to Gombe. And he said 2 weeks there taught me more about our relationship with animals than anything else. So he taught me, which I loved, how to think like a scientist. But when he said, you can't have empathy with your subject because scientists must be objective, it's rubbish. You can be completely filled with empathy and be extremely objective at the same time. It's just a little bit of discipline, that's all. And I think this lack of empathy and this cold science has led to a lot of cruelty through the ages. Would you agree?
I would, I think, and I think that's why I think you were so prescient in what you were doing, and I think it's made an enormous difference. I would probably safely say that those critics of your thesis and the old professors at the college, nobody knows who they are anymore, but we still know who you are, and I think that that's a great and very important thing. We certainly are seeing that in science of trying to really discourage a lot of unnecessary vivisection and animal use in laboratory experiments and so forth, but also just in recognizing that they're sentient beings and they have their own personality and they are part of this very important fabric that we all work together.
Yeah, and it was the chimps, because they're genetically so like us, they kind of opened the whole thing up. And so now, I mean, you know, we know the amazing intelligence of crows and ravens and parrots. We now know about the octopus. I mean, look, there's a creature with a funny little brain here and brains in each of the 8 arms, which can act independently if they're severed. And so it's a whole, so exciting for students if they want to study animal emotions and animal intelligence. It's fantastic.
You know, you just sort of on that topic is I know that you are so well known for having discovered that animals use tools with the famous termite hills and the chimps putting the little bits of bark in there. But you also comment in a lot of your books about the moment that you saw that chimps could be cruel and commit homicide, actually, and how very much like we are in that regard as well. And that was a very disturbing time for you that you discovered that.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, you know, all these similarities in nonverbal communication, kissing, patting one another in reassurance, you know, 2 males swaggering, hair bristling, lips bunched in a furious, or maybe waving an arm with a stick and trying to look as intimidating as they can. Doesn't that remind you of some human politicians?
Can think of a few.
I won't mention names, but you know, I can think of them too. And I was shocked to find they have a brutal and cruel side, that they can actually kill each other. There's a kind of primitive warfare. They're very territorial. And if a group of patrolling males sees an individual from the neighboring community, unless it's a young female before she's had a baby, they will chase and try and attack. And if they do attack, it's a brutal gang attack, which leaves the victim to die, wounds received. And it was very shocking to see that. And it was just at a time, I don't know if it hit America, but it certainly hit Europe with the animal behavior people, the nature-nurture controversy. You know, are we born babies with a blank slate, or is everything learned through experience? And I dared to say that I thought we had inherited aggressive tendencies from some 6 million year ago, ape-like, human-like common ancestor. And I mean, for a long time, other scientists they weren't very nice.
So, you know, I think that, and to sort of trying to have at least a little bit of hope here during this conversation about sort of where we are, is that you also saw incredible moments of compassion and kindness that the chimps performed. And you see that with other animals, of course, too. And it's more than just sort of anthropomorphic kind of transference from people. It's the real deal. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about those kind of events that you saw with the chimpanzees.
Absolutely. And I think one of the nicest examples, and it's kind of a fascinating one, a young chimp suckles until he or she is 5 years old, but less and less. By the time they get to 3, they can just about survive without the mother's milk, but they still ride on her back and sleep with her at night. And if the mother dies, then if there's an older brother or sister, automatically the child will be adopted. But on this occasion, little Mel lost his mother. He had no older brother or sister. He was 3 1/4 years old. The other chimps were nice to him, but there was no bond. And he followed them and occasionally would be allowed to ride on her back. And he was getting thinner and thinner. And to our amazement, a 12-year-old adolescent male, Spindle, adopted him. And what was so extraordinary is that Spindle not only would let Mel ride on his back, even keep him ventral if it was raining, allowed him to share his nest at night, shared his food with him. But if an infant gets too close to roused males who are doing these charging displays, they seem to, it's like seeing red. You talk, about it with soldiers in battle. And if an infant gets in the way, they'll treat it like it's a rock or a branch and just hurl it aside. And the mother's job is to keep the infant away. And Spindle took that role too, even though he then got beaten up. And normally a 12-year-old male is very cautious during these times of excitement. So there's absolutely no question. Spindle saved Mel's life. So why? What's interesting, the epidemic that claimed Mel's mother also claims Spindle's old mother. And so one wonders, did that contact with this little dependent creature help to fill a gap? Because a 12-year-old is still spending time with mum, even an adult.
That's really amazing. We were talking a little bit about earlier this evening about the moment when the world sort of took a pause. And that was at the very beginning of the pandemic when we all were in lockdown and nobody was traveling and everybody was at home and it was something that we shared in common. I thought for a moment, even though this is a terrible thing that's happening to us, maybe this will bring us all together because it's something that unifies every single human on the planet. But something else also happened at that time was that nature was not bothered by the pandemic and kept sort of blossom. Bears were seen in Yosemite Valley wandering around, deer and foxes and so forth. Birds were chirping. There were no contrails in the sky. And that sort of speaks, I think, to the resilience of nature. And I know that's a topic that you've talked a lot about, that you do, and perhaps that's why you do have hope that we can turn things around. Can you maybe just follow up on that?
Yes, I've got these 4 reasons for hope, and I talked about one, the young people. Once they know the problems and we empower them to take action, they're moving mountains, seriously. And they are the future, and they're changing their parents and their grandparents. And that can be very significant. But then, yes, this resilience of nature. I talked about the bare hills around Gombe. Well, since we began Tukari, the hills are no longer bare. Trees are coming back. And the people understand that protecting the environment isn't just for wildlife. It's their own future. They need the trees, they need the shade, they need the forest for, controlling to some extent the temperature and the rainfall. And animals on the brink of extinction can be given another chance. It's happened again and again. I did a whole book about it. Plants too, same thing. So this resilience of nature is one of my real reasons for hope. Nature by itself or with a helping hand. And then this brain, this our intellect that separates more than anything else from other animals. So yes, chimps, elephants, octopus, all the rest of them, way more intelligent than people gave them credit for. But, just think of advances in medical science. That's your thing. So you know that no animal could develop a vaccine for polio, for example, or they've helped to do it, but it wasn't their wish. We sent a rocket to Mars. There's no end to our intellect. It's just very unfortunate that we've so often used it for things like weapons of mass destruction and better ways of killing and, better ways of extracting fossil fuel to add to the blanket of greenhouse gases that's circling the planet and trapping the heat of the sun, melting the ice and doing all the rest of the horrible things. But at the same time, science is beginning to direct its intelligence to, for example, renewable energy, the ways of sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. You mentioned earlier about science and using animals for finding cures. Well, now there's a lot of research in alternatives to using energies, which turn out to be much more reliable, much more accurate, and cheaper. But of course, the people whose livelihood depends on using all these poor animals, they don't like it. But, it's happening. And I know people doing it. I love them for it. So we're beginning to use our brain the way we should. And then there's what I call the indomitable spirit. Think of the people tackling tasks that seem absolutely impossible, and yet they tackle, and so often they succeed. And it's not just solving a problem out there, it's sometimes building their own life. They come as a refugee, they've got nothing, they've lost their family, and yet somehow that spirit that's determined to survive helps them find a way of making a living, and sometimes they become very successful. So, those are my main reasons for hope. But just lately, Kim, I've thought our species is at the mouth of a very long and very dark tunnel. And right at the end, there's a little light shining, and that's hope. But it's no good sitting at the mouth of the tunnel and saying, oh, I hope it comes to us soon. No, we have to roll up our sleeves. I love the expression, gird your loins. I'm not quite sure what it means, but it sounds great. So we roll up our sleeves and we gird our loins and we climb over, crawl under, work our way around all these problems like climate change and loss of biodiversity and poverty and unsustainable lifestyles and killing of the soil with pesticides and herbicides that are chemical and toxic and all the rest of it. But the good news is that there's a group of people or groups of people tackling every one of the problems, those I mentioned and those I haven't. The sad thing is they're so often working in silos, and they're not, if you don't see the whole picture, you can solve one problem and thereby create problems in other spheres. And it's a very simple example. Yay, we shut down this coal mine, we stopped all those horrible emissions from going up into the environment. Yes, great, but think of the people who've lost their jobs, who are falling into poverty, who are destroying the environment in order to survive. So we need more collaboration, more partnerships, working together. That's what we need. And if we can only do that, then we have real hope.
And you've been a great person with that regard. You've really gone forward and sometimes with criticism, reached out to big industry and folks that were not particularly environmentally conscious and really swayed them by your passion and your eloquence and all the things that all of us admire in you so much. So I think that gives all of us hope because you're hopeful. And I think that's why you're such a wonderful messenger for resiliency. Not to mention that you yourself are very resilient. Jane just celebrated a birthday. I won't say which one it was.
Why not?
Okay.
Next year it'll be 90.
It'll be 90 next year. It'll be a big one next year.
But Kim, I must add one thing before you close. You're about to close. And so you talked about me working with companies like fossil fuel or something like that and getting criticism. If you don't talk to people who don't agree with you, how can you ever expect them to change? But when you do talk with them, it's no good arguing because I've seen it happen. People, they close their mind to what you're saying. They're thinking of how to refute you. They're not going to let you win. So it's not the brain you have to tackle, it's the heart. And how do you tackle the heart? With stories, the right story that gets right in there. And even if you don't know it at the time, you put that seed into the heart.
And you're an exceptional person to do that. So I think that's why you've inspired so many people around the world, Jane. And it's been a pleasure. I don't want to make this too long, because I know we have some questions and you've had a very long day. I was going to ask one final question of where do you get your energy? Because you travel thousands of miles all the time. You're giving lectures constantly, writing books, inspiring people, telling the world to wake up and get things rolling here. Where do you get your energy? What makes you really happy?
Well, I get my energy, partly from audiences. If you have 5,000 or 10,000 people crying and laughing and telling you afterwards, I promise now I'll do my bit. I mean, that has to make you feel you're on the right path and you're doing the right job. So, that audience reaction, the reaction of different people, that's one reason. Then I get huge inspiration from being out in the natural world, even if it's lying under a tree in a park. And this spiritual connection that I feel with the natural world, this feeling that there is a great spiritual power. I don't care whether other people believe it or not. I feel it, and it gives me strength. So therefore, for me, that's a way of carrying on.
It's a very nice way to close our conversation. And I know that there's at least 250 people on the other side of that computer that are applauding, and probably some of them crying, as that often happens when you're in front of a live audience. So, I just, as usual, Jane, I don't know how to thank you. It always is very an amazing thing that I can remember sitting in my living room. My mother's sitting right over there, watching the Jane Goodall and the Wild Chimpanzees on a film that we'd rented from the library. And who knew that years later I'd be sitting in my own living room. So thank you, Jane. All right, so I think we can take a few questions if there are some. I'm going to look on here. Maybe everybody's been.
And if you can see us, hello, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't see you.
Let's see. I don't see any questions. Are there no questions? Let's see. Sue Laszlo, you have a question. Ask her to. Can you unmute?
I was just experimenting to see. I was just raising my hand to say that I saw you, and then the Q&A popped up there. But very interesting. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Any other questions? People have hands up? There's 5. There we go. Now they're coming in. Okay. All right. Somebody said, "Are you two drinking bourbon?" No.
Whiskey.
Dr. Goodall has whiskey and I have
my
water,
brother-
but I did have a gin and tonic. This is from Alice Druffel. Hello, dear Jane. What is 1 or 2 ways that folks can be inspired by the natural surroundings and work to preserve our beautiful planet?
Well, just be out there and open your mind and listen and smell. Try and get as far away from civilization as you can, which may be very difficult, and just see what comes into your mind.
So we have a comment here from, thank you very much, Ms. Goodall. You have been someone I've admired since I was about 8, have gone on to be a veterinarian, but find the state of the world scary, and you've helped lift my point of view tonight.
Thank you. That's why I do what I do. Why else do you think I travel all these miles?
And there's another one. Thank you for being an inspiration. Thank you for being an incredible role model for women in science, which is absolutely true. And especially for your message on empathy in science, which is so important for all fields. That's from Emma. John Sharp wanted to know, do you know David Attenborough personally?
Yeah, I know him. Not well. We have not really had that much to do with each other, but of course I know and admire him.
And what is your relationship like? You don't have to go into that if it's compromising.
No,
Okay.
I don't really have a relationship per se. We sat and talked together a few times.
Maggie says, thank you for this incredible opportunity. You're an inspiration. Mary Mendelson, one of our board members, is thank you for an inspirational injection. I
like this because it means I don't have to work anymore.
You don't have to know. We'll just scroll through your compliments here. So people, keep them coming here. After all your time with chimpanzees, which species is closest to humans?
What?
What animal do you think is closest to humans? Do you think it's chimpanzees or?
Well, genetically, yes, absolutely, along with the bonobo. And then comes the gorilla, and then after that, the orangutan.
Jeff Neff asks, how successful do you find the Greenbelt movement, and do you have any collaboration with it?
I know what the Greenbelt does. I read their statements that they make every day. The Greenbelt, oh, there's trees across Africa. We have contributed to it in certain places. And I think it's a good idea, but it's not working terribly well because trees in the desert isn't always very successful, and sometimes the wrong kind of trees are being planted. I think that's what you're referring to, the Green Belt movement.
Kathleen, thanks you for the meeting and wanted to follow up on the emerging recognition of sentience of non-human animals. You've spoken to that quite eloquently, I think.
Well, there's a wonderful site that's got messages about this every day by Mark Beckhoff, and You can Google him. He's got wonderful, wonderful stories out just about every day about animal sentience.
Oh, here's a good one. Will the new king make a difference for the state of the environment?
Well, the new king officially isn't allowed to take sides or have an opinion or anything like that. But I have a feeling that because Charles has always been very passionate about the environment and anti-GMOs and organic farming, that he will certainly try.
We asked Jane if she was invited to the coronation, but she wasn't, unfortunately.
Well, I might have been. I don't know. How would I know?
That's true. Well,
I
if
would
you
come
are,
to the office. I might have
you
been.
maybe, well, maybe you'll get one now.
But I can't go because I'll be somewhere else.
You'll be in Austria or something. Heather wants to know, have you, is there anyone you haven't had the opportunity to meet that you would like to?
Right now, I think I've met most of the people I really want to meet.
We just got one from Joseph Schreiner Nesselhut, who is a little boy who has wonderful parents, who I think are the ones who wrote this, because I don't think that he's able to write yet. But he wanted to thank you for this evening. I'll tell you more about him afterwards. Really,
well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I have so much that I owe to my mother and the way she brought me up. The fact that she supported me. You know, everybody else laughed at me when I said I'm going to grow up and go to Africa and live with wild animals. She just said, if you really want to do this, you'll have to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity. If you don't get up, hopefully you find a way.
I think your mother, Van, and my mother, Lori, are kindred spirits because she's done the same thing. This is from one of my best friends, Robin Olschner. She just said, what an honor to get to hear you in such a personal format. Kat Morgan, thank you so much. You're an inspiration. We're grateful for your work in speaking out. Sandy asks, do you see any comparisons between the actions of chimpanzees when environments are threatened and the divisions in society these days?
What?
So sort of comparing, are there any comparisons or similarities with chimpanzees that are in stressful environments and how that mirrors the same situation for humans if they're in a stressful political strife or?
Well, if they're in a stressful situation, you know, they usually rush to try and find security with another individual. It stems from the child will always run for reassurance to the mother. And as they get older, they still run to mum, or they'll go to a brother, or they'll go to some other individual that they formed an alliance with. They also throw tantrums a lot, especially when they're young, but some of them when they're older too.
Yeah, we know that one. One of our board members asks, are our efforts, one of the things that we do at the Phil Simon Clinic is to train young people to become doctors and nurses and veterinarians, hopefully soon. And one of our board members is asking, do you think that's a worthwhile investment in Tanzania?
Oh, yes, definitely, 100%. We have some, Tanzanians are amazing, and we do a lot of training and getting scholarships, particularly to girls, but to the young men as well. And we've seen them blossom. And one of them, and you, I don't think you met him, but you heard about him. He lost his foot.
Yes, we met him.
Yes, I thought you met him.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
He's almost qualified now as a doctor.
That's amazing. No, they're very. I think the future is certainly for the African continent, are in programs where young people are trained to become professionals, healthcare professionals, and other higher levels of education. Dr. Powell, who's a wonderful pediatrician who's been on many of our trips, has been inspired by your optimism, and he's very grateful. Karen Marks, you have inspired me and my daughter to make the world a better place. Both became vegetarian this year. She's a sophomore at UC Davis, animal sciences pre-vet, and we watched your documentary together and love you. And any thought about the emotions of trees as outlined by Suzanne Simard?
This is becoming quite something. People keep talking to me about this because we know trees communicate. They have these microfungi attached to the roots, and it can spread through a whole forest. They can put out pheromones if they're attacked by caterpillars, so that other trees of the same species can put extra toxin into their leaves. And now people are beginning to say that they can communicate in other ways and that they feel pain. So, you know, I became a vegetarian because of I didn't want to eat animals. I became a vegan when I can because of the way dairy cows and poultry are treated, which is horrific. But now if we can't eat those things, and then we find trees are sentient, that's the end of the human species, which I'm sure the planet would love.
Perhaps there might be some benefits to that. John Sharp asks, do you think that there is hope that we can and will adopt some of the ways of Indigenous people? I know you have a lot of connections with Indigenous people.
We
around
are
the world.
beginning to listen to their voices, and it'll be a meeting because Indigenous people are moving towards a slightly different form of life, away from totally being totally dependent on nature and so on. I mean, they're moving towards using modern medicine as well as their own. And a lot of people are trying to move back closer to that sort of life. So it'll be a meeting minds, and I think it'll be a really, really good thing.
So I'm going to ask Nora Caldwell a question. She's a young 10-year-old who had a school project, and she wanted to know about if you brought your chimpanzee. I think she's referring to Mr. H, but she does mention Jubilee.
Yeah, well, Jubilee was a chimp.
Yeah.
Jubilee was given to me by my father.
And where's Jubilee now?
Jubilee is in a bulletproof glass case in the exhibit that was here in Los Angeles called Becoming Jane, put on by the Geographic. And it's now moved on to, I think it was in Denver. It's been to Chicago, or it's going to Chicago. So anyway, Jubilee is wherever that exhibition is.
So Jubilee is still around, Nora, so maybe you can have a chance to see her. Him. Christina Schaefer says, when you were very young, you began this work. Have you identified any young conservationists or groups who we can be looking to and supporting in future conservation work?
Oh, there's so many of them. I mean, right now, if you support JGI, we've got roots and shoots, and we've got hundreds of thousands of young people around the world who, many of them are passionate about conservation. So if you want to support any of them, support us, please.
Roots and Shoots, you can, they have your own website in addition to the JGI, right? Or
Well, there is one, but I mean, it is a program of JGI.
Right, so you can just go to the jgi.org website and also Roots and Shoots and just Google that and make it.
Or you can talk to Kim.
Or you can talk to me. Megan, who's one of our, married to one of our wonderful infection prevention nurses at Huntington, thanks you. You're an inspiration for all the things that you do, and plant seeds in other hearts is brilliant. And Dr. Colhase says she's 100% behind us with these knowledge about dogs, that they know what we're thinking and feeling. And Kat Morgan wanted to know, what books do you recommend besides yours?
Well, it depends what sort of book you want. I mean, if you want a serious, solemn book, or you want something just to take your mind off. And my favorite book in the latter category is Lord of the Rings, because A, it creates a complete world, and B, it mirrors what's happening now, and it ends with hope. So and it's beautifully written. I mean, it's exquisitely written.
Well, there you go. There you go, folks. John Rodarte, who's one of our pediatricians, he was on our last trip to Tanzania. He just is thanking you. He had first read about you as a 19-year-old anthropology major in college, and you've been a role model for him ever since. So and then Greg Crawford, one of our board members, also said it's an honor and privilege to hear you speak tonight. What's your opinion of a physical clinic in Tanzania as part of our program?
I mean,
us building a clinic.
I think it would be a super idea.
There you go, Greg. So pack your hammers. Debbie Pop says, you've always been an inspiration to me, and we need your message of hope. Such an honor to hear you. So I think this has been a wonderful evening. We hope that you are all now more hopeful, thanks to Jane. We've got some very nice cupcakes waiting for us, so we're going to sign off.
I hope some of you have a glass somewhere near, so we can say cheers.
Here's to David Graybeard. And
David Graybeard. He's gone, so let's cheer to the future.
Let's cheer to the future.
Children.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the next generations.
Thank you, everyone. If you're interested in making a donation to the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania project, you can go on our website, www How many W's is that? 3 W's. Phil Simon,
You don't have the whiskey.
Tanzania.org. No, this is water. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Bye.